Our focus today is on local climate action plans, and we have three representatives from 3 cities in Iowa who are really the leaders on that issue. So I want to start by giving each of the panelists a few minutes to introduce themselves, and I'd like them to state their own interest in climate action and also explain their role at the city. Let's start with Sarah Gardner.
Tough to be first. Well, I'm Sarah Gardner. I work with the City of Iowa City in the newly formed Climate Action and Outreach Division. This division was formed from what had previously been our Sustainability Office in direct result of having adopted a Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. I have been active in the sustainability and climate change sphere in a number of roles for almost 2 decades now. I started out actually as a journalist covering climate change and sustainability initiatives in the Midwest, and then made the decision to go back to school and get a master's degree in urban planning as a way to activate all the knowledge I had gained from seeing the different actions cities were taking across our region in hopes that I could help implement it somewhere. And luckily, Iowa City took me on to help with that work.
Great, thank you. Gina Bell.
Hi, good morning. I'm with the City of Dubuque. I'm the sustainability coordinator there. I'm housed within the city manager's office, but sometimes I get to be the Office of Sustainability all on my own. I'm the only full-time employee, and I have 1 part-time intern, and then I also supervise 5 Green Iowa AmeriCorps energy and community team members. And so they really focus on energy efficiency in Dubuque. And so the first sustainability coordinator in the state was hired by Dubuque in 2008. That was not me. I started about 2 years ago after returning to Iowa. I grew up in Iowa and I came back after 20 years away for this job. And I think I've been an environmentalist my whole life. The reason I left Dubuque was to go save the rainforests in the Pacific Northwest. I spent time in Ecuador in the rainforest. I really wanted to save the rainforest. I still want to save the rainforests. But I think my commitment to this work specifically really happened when I became a mom and just saw how much the environment has changed in my lifetime, and wanting to solidify that my kids are going to have a future and their kids are going to have a future if they choose to have them. And so I'm excited to be doing this work, and sometimes I feel really overwhelmed by it.
Thank you. Josh Mandelbaum, could you tell us both about your work on council and your professional work?
Yeah, so I'm Josh Mandelbaum. I'm a Des Moines City Council member. I've been on the Des Moines City Council since 2017. Well, I guess I'll also tell you my personal background and sort of how it fits into Des Moines work. So I am in my day job, since being a city council member is in theory a part-time job, I'm an environmental attorney, and I work at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, where I focus primarily on clean energy and clean water issues. So I work on sustainability issues, not on the city level, but on a more policy and macro level, day in and day out, on a personal level. I've always had an interest in environmental work and environmentalism. This goes back, I grew up in Des Moines, and my early memories, our family vacations were piling in the minivan and driving west to our national parks. And so that gave me an appreciation. In high school, I was a member of Students for Environmental Action at Roosevelt. In college, I focused on environmental sociology. And then I got involved in policy work and was maybe a little bit away from the environmental work for a number of years, but I worked in state government as a policy advisor to Governor Vilsack and Lieutenant Governor Peterson. And then I went to law school and was in private practice for a few years when the opportunity at an Environmental Law and Policy Center opened up. So that's my broad background. To give a little context for the city of Des Moines, we're maybe a little farther behind in some ways than some of these other communities. We actually just hired our first sustainability director in May, which is a step forward, but we have not been an early adopter in that regard, although we've done a number of things from a climate perspective. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about it, but we're starting to get more cohesive and map out a plan. But as we'll probably explore, we're behind Iowa City and Dubuque in some of those ways.
Thank you all three. That's a really good segue. I want to give the audience a sense of kind of where Iowa is with these plans. And it's really convenient. We have three cities that are kind of at different stages in their, as far as having a cohesive climate action plan that they're making a formal effort towards. So I want to go back to Gina. Dubuque was maybe the first city in Iowa and one of the first cities in the whole region to adopt a formal climate action plan. Can you take us back to the first iteration of that plan, a little bit of the background on that, and then how it was updated this year?
Sure. So I grew up in Dubuque, as I mentioned, and Dubuque did a really great job of reconnecting to the Mississippi River as it sort of dug its way out of the economic and farm crisis of the 80s. And it grounded itself in nature, which I'm really appreciative of now as an adult. And the commitment to that grounding, along with great leadership by our mayor and our city council, helped us recognize that adopting sustainability as a city ethos would give us a competitive edge, economically, environmentally, and socially. And so as early as 2006, the Dubuque City Council named sustainability as a top priority, and it's named it as a top priority every year since, during its annual goal setting process. And in 2011, Council adopted the goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% of our 2003 levels by the year 2030. And then 2 years later, they adopted a plan to help us meet that goal. We spent much of the last 12 months updating the plan, and the council just adopted that in August of 2020. And I think a lot of the initial work was really great. The plan was written by volunteers, community activists, and really pushed Dubuque at a time when it wasn't the most popular thing to have a climate action plan. But fortunately, our leadership saw the challenge and saw that it was important, and so they adopted it. And it helped us get some early reduction wins, along with grid updates and technological advances. But with our update, I really wanted to focus on leading with equity and focus on climate justice, because we know that we can have the best climate action plans in the world and the best reduction plans, but if it's not people-centered, then it doesn't mean anything. And so I really wanted to include the community, not just the climate activists, but everybody, and look at how this plan can work for our entire community. And so I hope that's what we've done in this plan, but we did lay it out in a way that says, hey, this is what council has to do. This is what city staff has to do. But then it says, here's what households have to do. Here's what businesses have to do. And it helps people see, hey, where's my part in this? And we're at about a 27% decrease of our greenhouse gas emissions. We have a really heavy lift ahead of us 10 years out. And we don't want to wait until 2029 to meet these goals. We want to start meeting them early on. And so hopefully with this plan, we've got our action steps laid out and we can start implementing them. We're budgeting for it right now.
Could you elaborate a little bit? I'm interested in the equity and justice angle. So as you were doing the reworking the plan, what was the process actually like? What were the ways to bring in those stakeholders?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my first year before we started doing the plan, my first year in this job, building relationships and meeting with people and hearing what they had to say, and not necessarily talking about climate action plans, but saying, hey, what are your challenges? Or what do you think the city should do about this? What's important to you? And then linking it to climate action potentially, and maybe not even ever using those words. But I think, so I had that basis, and then we formed a community team, which was a mixture of city staff that works in buildings and health and transportation, and waste, and then community members who either had an area of expertise related to climate action, or were passionate, or wanted to have a seat at the table. And some of that work got interrupted by COVID. You guys may have heard of that. It's this health thing that's happening. So you can't gather, but I'm excited. So we did the plan. We moved forward with the information that we had. I wanted to do a lot more community engagement on the front end. Because of COVID, we weren't able to, but it's actually working out, because what we're doing in this early implementation phase is having these really in-depth conversations, one-on-one conversations with people, now that we have the plan. And so hopefully the idea is that it's going to be help to continue to build ownership of the plan, and people are going to see, hey, this is where I fit in this plan that already exists. And then in terms of the justice piece, like, we know that our low-income populations and our people of color that live in a certain area of town are most likely to be impacted by climate change. And so our plan is looking at how do we solve for that? Because we know that if we can solve for that, everyone else in the city is going to be fine. And so it's with that lens that we created the plan. And hopefully, as we implement it, that's how it will continue to work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me go to Sarah. Iowa City has had sustainability initiatives for some time, but it's been just a few years since they adopted a formal climate action plan. Can you tell me what the city has, how the strategy has even changed in a short couple of years, and how your position fits into it?
Oh, sure. What we know with most city plans, planning is the bread and butter of city operations. Whenever a city has something it needs to achieve, it begins the planning process. It says, gets the engineering work done, says, here's the materials we're going to need, here's the staff time, here are the resources. Then it goes into a budgeting plan, and eventually the city funds it and builds the road or improves the sewer system. A climate action plan is actually fairly unique in the ecosystem of plans, in that most of the actions, as Gina noted, actually have to be done by individual residents and businesses and organizations within the city. So when Iowa City adopted its climate action plan, part of that was looking at our greenhouse gas inventory. And we realized that 5% of the emissions from Iowa City were directly under the control of the city itself. And these were things that came from, like City Hall or fire stations or the fuel we use in our buses, which left 95% of the emissions outside of the city's direct control. And so my position was actually built into the plan to have someone who would interface with the community to talk about ways that they could be involved and to make sure that they had a voice in the planning process as well. I don't think, cities can't come into our homes and say, you're going to have an air source heat pump and you're going to like it, nor would we want them to, right? So we need someone to be in the community talking about what the benefits of these initiatives are, how we can achieve them, and really reporting back to the city. It's a conversation, not a monologue. Hearing from the community what help is needed for individual residents and businesses to adopt these measures. I would piggyback on what Gina had said about equity and justice being an important part of almost all climate action plans. I actually am sitting here trying to think of one that I know of that doesn't have that component in it because it's so critical. But I think we often think about it in terms of justice, and that's really important, right? We don't want to make plans that are going to negatively impact people without those folks having a say in it. We want to make sure that the folks who are most impacted by climate change have a voice and are directly benefiting from the plans we make. And as Gina rightly noted, if we help folks out who are maybe at the bottom of the ladder for whatever reason, that's going to raise everybody else up. But one thing that I have been thinking about a lot lately is that it's important to include equity and to make sure all people have a voice at the table, not simply for justice, but because the climate plan itself benefits from that. One of the things we know from national studies is that just under half of all white residents of the US believe that climate change is something that is needs to be addressed right away and is concerning. But close to and over, in some cases, 2/3 of Black and Latinx populations believe that this is something immediate that needs to be addressed. And what that tells me is that these voices are more effective at talking about the real concerns and what needs to be done. And they need to be in the plans, because that is how we move the plans forward, right? Part of that comes from the ways traditionally that these issues have been talked about in white populations, focusing on polar bears and nature, which is great, we love it, but probably isn't the most effective rallying cry. Whereas if we can focus it on people and the people who are affected, then it does become more immediate. It's sort of the difference between thinking about it as save the polar bears and save lives, right? We all want to save lives. That feels immediate and direct. And we need to be talking to the folks whose lives are going to be directly affected, which is all of us, but some of us to a greater degree.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I think we'll come back to this again and again, the idea of buy-in and also to reaching the whole community. In practical terms, what does that programming look like? What does that outreach look like, both during the pandemic, and hopefully what will it look like someday in normal times?
Well, the pandemic is the great challenge that we've all been dealing with this year. I think a lot of it is exactly what Gina had described about being out in the community and having those conversations, and not even necessarily having them about climate change, which can feel a little opportunistic. If there's a group that you're suddenly showing up at and saying, hey, I want to talk to you about climate change, and I've never talked to you before, and I'm not particularly interested in what you yourselves are doing, like, why would they participate in that process? So it's about understanding the connections that exist in the community and tapping into those networks. The challenge with COVID is that a lot of the efforts that Iowa City had planned to initiate and has initiated this year, like our week-long Climate Fest, initially we wanted to be throughout the community. We had visions that it would be in different parks. And then when that became infeasible, it had to all be online. And right away, once you take everything virtual, you start running into difficulties with the digital divide and who's able to access those materials or activities. So that's an ongoing challenge. I can't say that we have figured it out entirely, but we do have just really excellent community members thinking about it and working together to think of how we can overcome those challenges.
That makes sense. I want to turn to Josh. You ran for city council 3 years ago on a climate action platform. The city has made some progress, but as you mentioned in your opening comments, you're not where you'd like to be and where Iowa City and Dubuque are. What have been the barriers to moving forward in a more aggressive way?
Yeah, well, so there are a number of challenges in terms of moving forward. I'd like to start with some of the things that we have accomplished. Because we've taken a number of policy actions that are significant and that will ultimately help us reach our climate goals, but they've been done sort of in an individual context, like one-off actions. So for example, we went through a fairly long process to create a benchmarking ordinance that looks at our biggest buildings and the energy use in our biggest buildings, and measure that and disclose that and take the first step towards addressing building energy use. And we're targeting buildings that are 25,000 square feet and up, which that 1% of buildings has a huge impact, because those are the biggest buildings in our community. And so we've taken action there. We've implemented that. We've actually gotten pretty good participation in the first year of implementation on the reporting side, and that's going to be a foundation for future action. We've also done, since I've been on council, a number of smaller things. So for example, we're more aggressive about any project that has any sort of city incentive requiring significant energy efficiency as a term of that project. And so that's increasing the energy efficiency that's getting implemented going forward. We've taken action where we're starting to look at our vehicle fleet. And so we've added our first electric vehicles as a city and identifying over the long term how we look at vehicle electrification. All of those things have been done without a climate action plan, but those are things that are all going to, when we write our climate action plan, be a piece of it. One of the barriers that Des Moines has, we've got the financial challenges that big cities have, and we maybe have some unique challenges financially in the sense that, Des Moines being our capital city, we actually have 40% of our tax base that is exempt. And a number of those properties serve the entire region and in some cases the entire state. We have the Capitol complex in the home of state government. We have the state fair. Those serve the entire state and they don't generate property tax, which is how we fund our government. We've got a lot of amenities that when you come and visit Des Moines beyond that you might think of, like Wells Fargo Arena, if you've been there for a concert or sporting event, or the Civic Center, the Science Center, the Arts Center. All of those are tax exempt, and that's created some budget challenges. And that sort of leads to the other piece, is the way the Des Moines City Council has thought of itself historically. When I was running, there were people who told me, well, Des Moines City Council isn't about big policy ideas, it's about potholes and permits. And that's certainly a piece of what we do, but the policy and the vision making is a really important role for local governments. And one of the barriers is that I don't think my colleagues in my council have thought of us in that way. And so we haven't laid some of that policy groundwork. Our mayor is adopted by proclamation, for example, has adopted emission goals for the city, but the city council itself has never actually adopted emission reduction targets. And I think we're gonna solve that in the next couple of months because I'm introducing a resolution that does that and some other things, but we haven't done that. And so part of the barrier is just thinking about that. And then as a consequence, we've never funded the sustainability position before. So the fact that we've now added that sustainability position to focus on these things, and then we haven't funded actually drafting a climate action plan. And I think we're going to be doing that as well in the next year. So we're on the way, but it's just been an adjustment for folks who maybe have never thought of themselves as policy leaders on it to take that step.
Thank you. You mentioned the financing, which is really important. I don't want to get too deep in the budgeting weeds, but I do want to give our other panelists just, if you could tell us briefly if there are new funding sources that the city has explored for these programs, or how your departments are funded. Can I go to Sarah first? So I didn't prepare you for that. Maybe that's not a fair question.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It just suddenly struck me. I don't actually know how my position is funded other than it's baked into the city budget. But I will say one thing Iowa City did recently was pass an emergency sales tax levy that resulted in a pool of about $1 million to help with some of the things that we want to achieve. A lot of that money is being funneled into incentives. I spoke earlier about speaking with community members who want to take action, who know there are things they can do for their businesses or homes, but maybe can't quite afford it. And so we're using that pool of money to build grant programs and financial assistance programs to help our residents achieve those goals.
Thank you. Gina, do you have anything to mention on funding sources?
No, I was just thinking, I've seen the breakdown. They pull it from a couple of different places, but primarily it's generally funded. So it's,
Got it.
Yeah.
So that's what I was thinking. I don't think there are a whole lot of pots of money out there that are specifically for this type of work. I think cities have to find it in their existing funding structures in large part, right? Okay, that's what I was kind of getting at. I want to go back to Josh. I appreciate your take on kind of the political status on the Des Moines City Council. And I'm wondering, in a lot of cities, there's tension between real estate developers who are influential in city politics and climate advocates. What are your tips for navigating that tension, or how do you get developers to be on board with some of these things?
Yeah, well, it's a mix, and some of it, it's a question of approach. So with our benchmarking ordinance, where that tension was on full display, we tried to have a pretty extensive process. So we created a city energy task force to focus on the benchmarking, where we had almost a year of meetings and outreach and welcomed all stakeholders to the table as part of that process. So we were able to hear concerns and work with folks during that process. Doesn't always mean that you can address all of the concerns, and the tensions still exist, but it allowed us to look at multiple pathways and multiple options and get feedback during the process. So at least we knew and were aware of the barriers. In the context of benchmarking, for example, there's a more aggressive pathway that we explored and ultimately didn't have the political will to pursue, but we took the first step, which is the disclosure, the measurement piece. We actually also discussed this idea of a performance pathway to look at, do we make requirements for our poor performing buildings that we learn about? And we decided, at least in the initial stage, that no, we're not, we didn't have the political will to do that, because the building owners and the landlords were resistant to it. But we started that conversation, and we know that option is out there, and that tool is out there. And perhaps the fact that we even had that conversation provides some folks a greater incentive to engage. If they're advocating that voluntary is gonna help solve it, maybe provides them a greater incentive to engage in the voluntary side of this, to show that if they're advocating for voluntary solutions, they're committed to making that work. I maybe have some skepticism there, and we're still going to bump into those tensions, but that's a part of this process. The other thing, we also earlier this year got a letter from the home builders and realtors threatening to sue the city over an issue. We actually have adopted the 2015 International Energy and Conservation Code. The state has only adopted the 2012 Conservation Code. There's some history there. Back when the state sort of, well, there are questions about whether or not we're preempted from taking that more aggressive action. And the state, for a number of years, I've got old PowerPoints from over a decade ago where the AG's office either says that's an open question or that cities can actually go beyond it. And similarly, the Department of Public Safety, which oversees the building code, had at least not taken a position on that until recently. And that, since that issue's come to a head, you have some of these stakeholders that are trying to pressure us, but we still have other tools beyond that, right? If they don't want to be cooperative and don't want to work on that, Des Moines, for example, on new homes, provides abatement for all of those homes. So if we get rid of our stronger energy and conservation code, we can accomplish a lot of what we were doing by tying abatement to a stronger code. And so while we might be preempted from having a stronger code, we still have tools in that discussion. And so these folks still have an incentive to work with us on it.
Thank you. Gina and Sarah, you probably can't speak as candidly as our elected official member here, but did you want to jump in on anything about the politics of the legal authorities?
I would just say it's interesting hearing this, because I believe that both Iowa City's legal team and Dubuque's legal team decided to not pursue adopting a later goal because of preemption. So that's good news, Des Moines.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
my ears perked up when I heard that. We actually had our city attorney go to the state with that question about whether we could adopt a more aggressive energy code, and we're told no, that the state preempted it. And I think actually because we raised that question, we got Dubuque into some trouble. So sorry, Gina.
Well, I think that's what prompted the letter telling us to withdraw our code and threatening legal action over it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tension we deal with.
I do have a couple questions from the audience here. One is from State Rep Charles Eisenhart. So maybe I'll turn this to Gina first, because maybe you're his constituent, and see if the other two want to chime in. The question is about agriculture. How do we address the contributions we are making to environmental harm from the ag sector? What kind of urban and rural partnerships can we develop? Do you want to add anything on that, Gina?
Well, I mean, I think Chuck is really well aware of what Dubuque is doing in terms of our watershed approach. I do think as a state, we need to address the issue, obviously, not just for our own state, but for states downriver. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation exploring what are some ideas. I don't have any off the top of my head right now. And maybe Chuck is interested in knowing what other cities are doing.
Josh, I know you work with, in your day job, you have some interface with agricultural policy. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of pieces to this. I mean, there's obviously the watershed work that Gina referenced that we can do upstream and in partnership. I mean, every community is part of a larger watershed that has urban and rural areas, and there are opportunities to work upstream to get conservation implemented, and that has multiple layers of benefits, right? There's not just water quality benefits, there are climate benefits there. But one of the things when you're talking, I think, about rural Iowa and addressing climate solutions, you know, there are real opportunities for win-win situations here, and we're already seeing it play out. We have a tremendous renewable energy resource, and when we add, for example, wind turbines across the state, that has tremendous benefit to rural communities. They're adding to their tax base, they're diversifying their tax base. It provides economic driver and jobs. And so there are benefits and ways that rural Iowa can help with the climate solutions and benefit at the same time. And we need to just make sure that that's part of the conversation, that we highlight those benefits, because rural communities, they might not have thought about it, right? When you add wind farm to the mix in a rural community and their tax base has gotten stronger, and a number of folks in their community have diversified their revenue, those are real tangible benefits. They don't think about it as a climate solution, but it also happens to be that as well.
Thank you.
You know, go ahead.
Please. No, please go ahead.
I would just add, you know, it's not just wind, but solar is an incredible win-win for rural communities. We've actually seen a huge uptick of individual farmers putting solar on their land as a way to stabilize farm income. And that's been a great benefit these last few years. You know, whether you get 200 bushels an acre or 180, you can be producing electricity and selling it onto the grid every single day, which is great. You know, and the nutrient reduction strategies for watershed management, a lot of that involves planting deep-rooted grasses along streams, which not only affects water quality and nutrient reduction for runoff, but also one of the things we know from carbon sequestration studies is that prairie grasses are actually much better carbon sinks than trees are. Trees tend to store all their carbon up in the canopy in leaves that fall off and get cycled through each year, whereas prairie grasses put that carbon down into the ground in the roots, so they really are sinking that carbon. I think Josh captured it really well, saying, you know, it's a win-win situation all around.
Thank you. Thank you all. I have a comment here from the audience from Becky. She mentions Practical Farmers of Iowa is doing work on this issue, and they were at a different panel during this conference. She also mentions that counties are adopting their own plan, which here we're all talking with cities, which are going to have different focuses than counties. Counties are going to have more, maybe a little bit more of those rural interests. And so that's something we should think about for next year's conference, is to include a county voice in a platform like this. So thank you for that comment, Becky. Another question, I'll turn this to you, Sarah, since you mentioned tree canopy. Even though trees might not be the best carbon sink, they're still important. I think they still are part of the Iowa City climate action. Can you talk about how the tree canopy fits in, and also any impact that you're able to tell so far from the derecho a few months ago?
Sure. Well, I should say, we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. Trees may not be quite as powerful as prairies, but they're still very powerful in terms of carbon sequestration and an important part of the strategy in achieving our carbon emission goals. It's not enough, we know, to just reduce emissions. We also have to be sequestering carbon, and trees are an incredible tool for that. Iowa City, I'm a little embarrassed even to talk about the derecho impacts. We were impacted, but not nearly as much as our neighbors to the north in Cedar Rapids and Marion. And so there was an earlier panel today talking about reforestation strategies and how with every challenge, there's an opportunity. It's a huge loss for those communities to have lost those trees, but also now there's an opportunity to really be a national leader in how they reforest the city. I'm really excited to see those plans take shape, and quite happy to steal from those ideas down here in Iowa City.
Great. I want to turn to, sorry, to somebody.
I just wanted, while we're talking about the tree piece, I know there was an equity portion of what everyone's talking about, and trees really have an opportunity to tie in to some of the equity piece. We know from studies that the urban heat island effect tends to be more significant in poorer parts of our communities and in communities that have more people of color. And a big part of that is because there are fewer trees. We don't have that tree canopy that can help mitigate that heat island effect and provide shade and other benefits. So it's thinking about those layers of benefits that really have an opportunity to not just address climate, but also the equity issues in a climate action plan.
Thank you. Gina, did you have a word about trees?
No, I would just agree with what both panelists said.
Great. Let me stick with you for a question. Dubuque has been successful at engaging both non-governmental and intergovernmental partnerships in its sustainability plans. Can you maybe give an idea of how other communities might emulate it? And in particular, I suppose we have representatives from smaller communities here who might not be able to leverage the same resources as a Dubuque or an Iowa City. So how do you build those partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've only been at the city for 2 years, and so I get to sort of take credit for a lot of work that was done when I wasn't even in the state. But I think that Dubuque, under the guidance of Mayor Buell, really said, hey, we want to collaboratively partner within the city with our residents and outside of the city, and recognizing that we need to partner to achieve community goals. And Dubuque said early on, sustainability is our brand, and then said to partners, how can you help us make that happen? And so I think Dubuque has been really good at saying, hey, EPA, you set out this funding source, or you did this, but to make it work in Dubuque, we need to do it this way. Will you help us with that? And Dubuque's made sure that they kept up with our state legislature and our federal officials so that they know what's happening in Dubuque, so we can celebrate our successes when we do have a project that we see through. And Dubuque's willing to take some risks and say, hey, no one's ever done this before. No one's pulled from here and this pot of money and this pot of money and done this, but we're going to try it. And so when we have our partners who are willing to or want to try something out, Dubuque is like, pick us, we'll try. And then I think, having a constant contact with our state and federal officials has been really beneficial in maintaining our relationship, and it's helped open a lot of doors. I think, again, they're also grounded in nature, so they recognize the interconnectedness, not just of funding streams, but of watershed work and transportation systems and equity. These things don't stop at city borders or county borders or state borders. And so we recognize that these partnerships are key. And I don't know exactly how all of these partnerships have been built, but I know from my own work, continuing to show up and be willing to take some risks have been really helpful. But you have to be in front of people so they remember. It's really easy if you have a phone call or you have a great conference and you get all these ideas. If you don't stay in front of it or stay in front of the person, they're going to forget you. And we have so much information coming at us. So it really is kind of just a presence, here, don't forget about us, and that constant reminder.
Thank you.
So I would say, I think, to my best understanding, that's what Dubuque has done in the past and will continue to do to build on our partnerships and keep making things happen.
Sure. Yeah, same theme to my other panelists. Can you speak to the level of regional collaboration or opportunities for business partnerships and things like that? I'll go to Sarah first.
Well, Iowa City, of course, as part of our incentive program, is looking very closely at industrial and commercial properties in the city and ways that we can partner with them to help achieve energy efficiency goals. Those collaborations obviously are very critical, but I think more broadly, we also need to be thinking about collaborations between cities. Earlier, we were discussing, energy codes and wanting to create higher standards for buildings, which is all well and good. And we do need some progress on the state level. But at the end of the day, if Iowa City adopts a higher standard for building codes, but Coralville and North Liberty and Tiffin don't, essentially what we're saying to developers is go develop in those other communities. And, that is not a goal that we want to embrace. So it's so important, to be having these conversations within the city, but also with our neighbors. Ultimately, as Gina and Josh have both noted, these issues, climate change is a global issue. It affects all of us. It doesn't stop at the borders of Iowa City or Dubuque or Des Moines. And that means we need to be talking to our neighbors about coming up with regional and statewide and national and international solutions. All levels are important.
Josh, could you, whatever's on your mind, but could you in particular reflect on the point that Sarah made about, competing cities, that if one city does something, then, business might move to the suburbs?
Yeah, I mean, that's always something that you hear and that comes up time and time again. So the Des Moines Metro has an entity that they call MAC, the Metro, well, I might get the acronym wrong, Metro Advisory Council, that is supposed to look at some of these policies regionally. In fact, when Des Moines adopted the 2015 Energy and Conservation Code, it went through sort of a regional building code vetting, and then Des Moines ended up being the only one to adopt it. The other communities were, in theory, supposed to come along. So that is absolutely an issue and a concern. And there are ways around it by looking at the incentives to help reach those goals and other ways that you can work to achieve that. But yes, having that baseline across the board is important. And it's always going to be a challenge and always a tension too, particularly in a metro like Greater Des Moines, where you have a lot of communities and a lot of different councils and some very different perspectives on the role of building codes in achieving these type of goals and the role of city governments in achieving these type of goals. But at some point, the communities need to lead on it, and it can be easier. So for example, this is a water example, but it's a climate adoption example. The city of Clive has a topsoil ordinance for development. They have a 4-inch topsoil ordinance, which captures more water where it falls and has impacts on the watershed. Happens to be easier for the city of Clive to adopt it because they're landlocked and limited in terms of new development. So adopting something like that maybe has less of an impact, but it's a way that they can help lead the conversation in the direction where it needs to go. And that's a piece of this as well. I'll talk about, another regional cooperation piece that is important from a climate perspective, but I don't think in Des Moines is framed that way. Our transit authority is regional in nature, and that comes with its own challenges in terms of how do you fund it, how do you provide equitable service, a whole host of challenges there, but that's an important partnership and important, you're not going to have climate solutions and a climate plan without a really important transit component to it. And then I'll give another example within that transit realm of a partnership and interest aligning. DART in the Des Moines metro area just rolled out our first 7 electric buses. And that was a partnership with Mid-American Energy. They helped essentially cover some of the increased costs between electric buses and a conventional diesel bus. We also got FTA grants and worked with other partners as well. So you had the full mix of federal partners, our utility company, all coming together on that. But that's a really good example of where our interest in addressing climate and in providing better service, because those buses also are quieter and they don't have emissions. So where that goes through the community, they're very, very localized benefits that aren't necessarily climate benefits, but are environmental, are quality of life benefits as well. And we're aligned because Mid-American has an interest in electrification as a solution. And it's looking for those opportunities where interests align and recognizing that they might not align everywhere and that at other times you might be at odds on things, but where you align, look for those partnerships, build and implement those solutions.
Sarah, my understanding is Iowa City is in a somewhat similar situation. Mid-American supplies a large share of the energy. And so whatever greenification Mid-American does is reflected in Iowa City's success, right?
Yes, to a degree. Our goals are to reduce our emissions 45% by 2030, and that feels very much in reach, in large part because of the work Mid-Am is doing to build out wind energy. But we also have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050, and that's a little more difficult because those greenifications of the energy sources will only get us so far. And that's where the energy efficiency programs that the city has come into play, amongst other things. Like Dubuque, we have a team of Green Iowa AmeriCorps members who go around and help with energy efficiency, particularly for low and moderate income households here in the city. And one of the things I find myself talking a lot about with climate change solutions is it's very easy to get excited about the technological process we're making, and with good reason. Solar is amazing. These wind turbines are amazing. Electric vehicles, if you've ever ridden in one, you suddenly don't want to ride in anything else. They are so quiet and so cool. But there are all sorts of little interventions that we've had all along that actually are just as valuable, if not more so. And that includes, less exciting things or less exciting feeling things like increasing insulation, buying energy efficient appliances. At the end of the day, the greenest electron on the grid is the one that never had to be generated because it didn't need to be used.
Gina, could you chime in on the state of the utilities and their progress in Dubuque area?
Yeah, so we do not have Mid-American, we have Alliant Energy here, and certainly we are in discussions with them about electrification of our fleet, so on. They have not yet offered to cover any of the cost differences, but we can keep working on it. And some of that is just building the partnership and laying out the plan and trying to figure out how we make it work within city operations. But they have a great interest in the city electrifying our fleet and have been really great partners in helping us create a plan to move forward with that.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience I just want to touch on briefly. Josh, I think you could cover this. I think it was 2 years ago, the legislature passed a bill to stop requiring the utilities to make energy efficiency program payments. Does that sound familiar? Could you give us just a brief overview of that?
Well, so yeah, they put in caps on the, bottom line, a whole host of constraints in terms of caps and cost effectiveness mechanisms that significantly limited what those programs were compared to where they were before. Now we still have programs and programs that can be used very effectively, but they had a larger budget and could reach more folks prior to that legislation, which is a real shame because, as Sarah said, that's an example where environmental interests and consumer interests are really well aligned, because the cheapest form of energy is often the energy that you save. The greenest form of energy is that energy that you save. So there are consumer benefits and environmental benefits there. The program still exists, and there's still a lot of good that can be gained from those programs. And part of the way that you make the case for legislative change is implementing the existing programs and taking advantage of the existing programs and building a constituency for the existing programs so that we can educate policymakers about their effectiveness and the need to unleash the full potential of energy efficiency. But it's an unfortunate constraint, and we've got to work within it. But I can tell you, as a Des Moines policymaker, one of the things that we do is we require that's one of the incentive pieces. When we're looking at an economic development incentive, we're pushing those developers to look at the commercial new construction program from Mid-American that still exists, because we're still going to take advantage of it and get everything we can out of it.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that each of our panelists gets a couple minutes to offer some closing remarks. So let's move to that. I'd like each of you to explain how they can keep in touch with what your city is doing on climate action, and then also offer some final thoughts, in particular for folks who are here who are from city governments or who are advocates in their own communities who don't yet have climate action plans, and kind of what you'd like them to carry with them so that they can be better advocates. And let's start with Josh.
Yeah, well, this has been a great discussion, and there's a lot that we can do collectively. One of the things the cities, collaborating, those of us who have sustainability goals, there are things that we can leverage together. I've tried to look at climate action and all of the policies and actions we can take. I want to introduce one more to the conversation. And this is going to be something we're going to start talking about in Des Moines on Monday. Is I've introduced a clean energy standard resolution, and obviously our utilities have a role to play in helping us meet these goals. And Mid-American has done a tremendous job adding wind, and we're in a strong position because of what they've done. They've got this 100% renewable vision, where they're going to keep adding wind, but it's not going to lead to any coal plant retirements. And the ultimate goal and the next step is to reduce emissions from our fossil fuel unit. So we're going to be looking at a 24/7 100% renewable standard and setting that as a goal. We've got a ways to go before we adopt it. We've got buy-in to there, but that's something that we've seen be an effective driver of climate action across the country. We've seen entities like Google, the 24/7, 100% renewable vision is something that Google's adopted with goals by 2030 to reach that. We've seen cities in other states adopt strong goals that have then pushed their utility. For example, Excel's a really good example. Excel adopted a 2050 net zero goal because local communities adopted clean energy goals that helped push them along that path. So we can be visionary and set goals and aspirations and help bring along other stakeholders in that process. But we can also look at climate action in the things that we do every single day as a community. The transportation side of things, which is another major emission source we didn't spend a lot of time talking about. Electrification might seem sexy, but it's not just electrification. It's reducing vehicle miles, whether that be through transit or creating the kind of places that people want to live, those walkable, bikeable places. That's part of what cities do from a placemaking perspective anyway. But that's a climate solution. If you create, dense corridors that have all of those type of amenities, the restaurants,
Josh,
shops.
I hate to cut you off, but I want to give my other panelists a minute. Thank you.
Nope.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Sarah?
Well, I can just pick up where Josh left off and say, walking and biking are great. They're another one of those low-cost interventions that can make a big difference. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about looking at the technology that's already available and can be deployed. I think on an individual level, one of the takeaways I would offer up is that a lot of these solutions, are already at hand and are already being embraced by residents in cities, whether or not they have a climate action plan. So we have a lot of great foundations to build on. And in some ways, it's less an issue of reinventing the wheel than it is just changing our mindset. I'll use transit and biking and walking just as an example. I've had folks talk to me about when I'll say, I'm trying to incorporate more biking into my daily routine or riding the bus, and they'll say, I just don't have time for it. And then in the same conversation, we'll talk about how they also don't have time to go to the gym, or they're trying to find more time to read. And I'll circle back and say, well, the funny thing is I started riding the bus because it met those goals for me. It gave me more time to walking to the bus stop, and it gave me more time to read when I was on the bus. And as it turns out, letting someone else drive is amazing and freeing. No wonder the wealthy like having chauffeurs, So I think in some ways, if we just see things differently and see how a lot of these actions already fit into our day-to-day lives, it's not about as much what you give up to achieve these goals as it is what you gain. And that is true on the individual level. It is also true on the city level. I mean, all of these communities, by virtue of having taken climate action, have seen benefits for the communities and for business retention and resident retention, which, it's a win-win.
Thank you, Sarah. We have about a minute and a half. Gina, can you close us out?
Sure. Everything that was stated would have been my answer. I really think that local governments can look at their policies and review them. There's so much space for updating them and making it so they're moving towards climate action. And I think just one thing that hasn't been mentioned already is looking at building these partnerships and engaging the community, because oftentimes talking to residents, you can hear barriers to success. They might not call it climate action, but they can talk about their energy burden. They might not call it energy burden, but then you can link it to energy efficiency. And so there's lots of ways to link to this work that are solving other problems that city governments have to deal with. And so, and additionally, you get to have a relationship with your residents. So I would say the community engagement work is really important. And then we've been having a discussion in our Heartland group of sustainability professionals about having hope and should we have hope. And I think, I'm not going to say if you want to be hopeful or not around climate change, but what I will leave you with is that our incremental work is really important. And while we feel this sense of urgency, we have to make sure that we are doing slow, intentional work, because it is having a ripple effect.
That's great. I really appreciate this is a really expert panel that we jammed a lot into it. So thank you, especially to my panelists, and thanks to everyone for joining us for the Iowa Ideas Conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.